I'm only going to say this on the first source, but here you should pause the video, have a good look at the question, even try and write a little paragraph answer, and have a good think. What would you write? There's no point you just looking at the answers. So have a little look, have a little think, have a little write down notes, or actually write an answer, and then you can have a look at what I say. Remember, what I say is not the right answer, it's just an example of the sorts of things that you could have written about to give you some way in, some idea. And if you keep repeating this, you'll do some good practice, you see. As always with a how useful question, you have to begin by thinking, what from my own knowledge do I know about this particular topic that I recognise and see in the source? That is the easiest way to get into a how useful question. And of course, this source A, is by Chief Justice Warren, who he says in the judgment in the court case here is in favour of civil rights. He's saying that things should not be separate. And we know from our own knowledge that Chief Justice Warren had only recently been appointed and was definitely pro-civil rights. So you pop that in your answer, because this is useful, because you know that it's useful, and why that's significant. We also know this is useful for an inquiry into the position of black Americans, because it gives us the decision of the Supreme Court, which we know from our own knowledge led to other events like the Montgomery bus boycott and Little Rock High, and so on and so forth, because there's others. And we know it's useful because what it says, what Chief Justice Warren says, that it just separating white and coloured children had a detrimental effect, we know that's true, because of the controversial doll tests, which we've talked about in class. Look them up if you can't remember. We know about the racism in society, which came as a result of the races being separated. And it's also useful because what it shows us is the position of black people was different in the early 50s, because you know that this decision was taken in 1954. So the situation of black people in the early 1950s was different to perhaps the late 1950s as a result of this decision. All of those things you should be able to pick out and recognise, or even a couple of those things, and hopefully you did when you paused it. But you do have to be careful with this source, and that's always a little good phrase to put in there. However, you have to be careful with this source because it tells us the court's decision, but it doesn't give any indication of the massive outbreak of opposition that came as a result, or that many schools would not actually fully desegregate until the 1970s. So it only tells us the court's decision, but not actually details in how that affected the position of black Americans. And it didn't just change as a result of this decision, as we know from our own knowledge. So that's source A. For this sort of source, you're going to have done some of your own revision, because it's asking you about the impact of Brown versus Topeka, but hopefully you've recognised that this is from the Montgomery bus boycott, so you have to know that those two things are connected. Well, it's useful because it shows one impact of Brown versus Topeka was that it inspired other events. And you go into your own knowledge and say how once the Supreme Court had set a precedent and ruled that separating the races was just inherently unequal, then it was going to have a knock-on effect on other events like this, and it was inspiring people to action. The fact that civil rights had had a victory inspired the Montgomery bus boycott the following year. It's also useful because its impact was to encourage Southern African Americans to engage in the civil rights movement. What I was just saying, they'd won. Before, it maybe seemed hopeless to many African Americans, but they'd won a court decision in 1954. It set the ball rolling and encouraged leaflets such as this. It's also useful because it shows the peaceful tactics that were going to be used. Perhaps because the peaceful legal means of Brown versus Topeka had worked. And it says another Negro woman has been arrested. So it's happened before. But it may be no boycott was arranged, or it seems that way, doesn't it? And from our own knowledge, it suggests that was the case. So maybe, even though it happened before, Brown versus Topic happening had encouraged this leaflet and this boycott to be arranged. But if we're trying to look at the impact of Brown versus Topica, you do have to be careful with this source, because it's a leaflet encouraging the boycott, and it gives no indication that the person writing it was particularly inspired by Brown versus Topica. We can only really infer given the timing. Also, it's a leaflet designed to encourage, so it perhaps might exaggerate how outraged the African Americans were at this incident. It might over-exaggerate to try to make people join in with the bus boycott. So there we go. I hope you're starting to realise from doing this practice that doing a how useful question is a lot like being a detective. You look at what's there, you look at what you know, and you try to work out how useful this is as evidence. It even uses the word evidence, and that's what detectives are all about. You match the evidence to your own knowledge, and you also look at the provenance, where the source comes from, to try to work out if that affects how useful the source happens to be. Now then, this is from an actual sample paper, and it asks us how useful are they into the significance of Brown versus Topica. And we look at source B, well, it's useful because of the timing of if you look at the provenance and when it was taken, it shows that Brown versus Topica had an immediate impact, and therefore it was significant. It shows what history tells us, that the majority of schools were integrated, especially by the 1970s. It shows us that decisions, drafting a bit of our knowledge, it shows us that such decisions like Brown versus Topica were more easily and quickly put into action in the north, or at least not in the south, because Washington's kind of in the middle, which matches our own knowledge that ex-slave states in the deep south resisted change. But you do have to be careful, because this image is only from a northern, well, it's not really the north, but you know what I mean, not the deep south. The photograph looks harmonious, people look happy, and that might be over-exaggerating the reality of the situation. People are, in Washington at least, not necessarily going to be showing their racism and their opposition to what's going on, especially if there's a journalist there taking a photograph. So that might mean that it's not a particularly accurate representation of what the reality was in that school. It might be, that's why you have to say it might not be, and give you reasoning. You can never say it is or it isn't, because we don't actually know. And then you look at source C, and again you have to have done your revision to be aware of what the Southern Manifesto is. And if you are aware of that, you know this source is useful because it shows us the main argument that the opposition to the decision had. What was their justification for not integrating the races? And they said that the federal government of America, which federal means the whole country, was unjustified in its use of power. That it was overstepping the mark and violating the states' rights, who had the right to decide what happened in their state. It gives us an example of the Dixiecrat reaction to the decision. Now you would have to know what Dixiecrats were and use your revision to be able to bring that in. Very important to revise and bring our knowledge into this. But you do have to be careful with this type of source, because we have to be aware that this was the minority of people in the country rather than majority. And you also have to be careful because if we're thinking of the significance of Brown versus Topica, it incorrectly states that Brown versus Topica planted hatred and suspicion where before there was friendship and understanding, which is just blatantly incorrect. There was deep-seated racism, hatred, as evidenced by the existence of groups like the KKK in the South. It wasn't like Brown versus Topica brought hatred and suspicion, and it wasn't like there was friendship and understanding across the Deep South before. It's just wrong, and the reason it's wrong is it's trying to convince people that the federal government has overstepped the mark. So remember, you've always got to tie it back to the significance of the Brown versus Topica case. The first one yeah, it does give us a good insight into the significance of the case in places outside the Deep South, and in C it gives us a good indication of what many people felt about it within the Deep South itself. So taken together, they do actually give us quite a lot of information, and they're both quite useful taken together. But separately, they give us a little bit of a blinkered view of what was going on. Now, straight away, you should recognise the domino theory. It's quite a famous, easy thing to stick in your head from learning, and for explaining the reasons of US involvement in Vietnam, it's useful because it shows us at least the president's reason for intervening. And we also know from our knowledge that the domino theory was quite a widespread popular theory in the 1950s in the USA. It's also useful because it acknowledges China and probably North Korea when it's talking about 450 million people in Asia falling under communism. And American citizens felt that America had lost these countries, especially China, to communism, which is a bit arrogant because it wasn't really America's in the first place, but it shows that President Eisenhower was determined to show people that he was not going to lose any more of Asia to communism. And we know that China and North Korea had an influence on why America got involved. Again, though, you always use that little phrase. However, you do have to be careful with the source, because US involvement actually began under Roosevelt in World War II and carried on with Truman. Eisenhower didn't really start involvement in the Vietnam conflict. He just increased it. Bit of our knowledge, which shows that this is a bit misleading. And also, Eisenhower's explaining his theory probably to the US people, so he's probably dumbing down. He's not going through all the complexities for why he wants to get involved. It's just one aspect of it. It was probable that reasons for US involvement were likely to be more complex than what's just there. And we know that's the case. We know there's quite a number of reasons why America got involved in the Vietnam War. So there we go. That's source A. Now this can be used and viewed in a couple of ways for looking at the US defeat this time, so the opposite end of the war. It's useful because it shows the tactics the US were trying, which was airstrikes, to try to stop the communists from using what we would know, hopefully, as the Ho Chi Minh Trail to get supplies to the south. It's useful as well because we know airstrikes were a key tactic, like in Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Linebacker, and it's useful because it shows that the US was struggling to stop Ho Chi Minh because the Ho Chi Minh Trail, should I say, has lots of tentacles or lots of routes and paths through. But with the scissors thing, you do have to be careful with this type of source because it does seem to, it's a cartoon, it exaggerates, and it does seem to suggest that US were actually cutting the route south with those scissors. Those tentacles are falling off, whether they regrow or what, I don't know. I'm no expert on octopuses. If that's what you say, is it octopi? Who knows? You can tell I'm no expert. But it's not true that those routes were stopped. They never stopped the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They stopped maybe paths to block them temporarily, but supplies kept coming down from the north throughout the war. And it seems to suggest that supplies and communists all came from the north to the south, when in fact there was a huge amount of support for the communists and the Viet Cong from within the south itself. So they didn't have to just rely on things coming from the north all the time. So it's a very American view of the war. And finally, to another sample paper, and you look at the top source D, B even, silly me, it is useful because it shows a rare example of the usually silent majority as Nixon called them, who supported the war. Obviously, this is way before Nixon, but usually the protests that we see are the people anti-war. It's also useful because it shows us why so many people in America supported the Vietnam War. But, of course, we have to be careful with this source because it was taken in 1967, before My Lai and the Tet Offensive turned popular opinion against the war. My Lai being done in 1968 and being public knowledge from 1969, and the Tet Offensive being in 1968 and public knowledge immediately in 1968. You also have to be careful because it was taken for a national newspaper. And this photograph doesn't necessarily show the scale of the match, doesn't show you how many people were there, and it probably picks out a particularly interesting or dramatic protester because the point of it being in a national newspaper is to sell papers. They're going to choose interesting images. So that's source B. And source C, for an inquiry looking at attitudes in the US towards the war, is also useful because this person really shows how important the media was in affecting public opinion during the war. And I'd pick out a quote from the source, of course, to illustrate that. It's also useful because it really shows the strength of feeling and how angry this person is about what was going on and how determined people were to do something about it. But again, you have to be careful. This was a student at risk of being drafted, and students were more likely than the majority to be anti-war. He's also talking about it after the war, so in hindsight, looking back, and after 1968, when public opinion and the media had turned against the war. And by the 2000s, it was certainly the most likely held view that people looked back at Vietnam as a bit of a disaster. So for him to say how angry he was about it, how determined he was to do something about it, another point there is he might be overplaying just how angry he was about it to show that he was on the right side in the Vietnam War and being against such a catastrophic disaster and an embarrassing one as well. So you do have to be careful with memoirs and interviews way after the event, because people can overplay their own role or over-exaggerate their own views and opinions at the time to fit in with what's accepted at the point the interview is made. And there we go. There's a bit of how useful practice. I hope you found that useful. See what I did there? And I'm going to go back to the rest of my life. Thanks very much. Hope you use this. Do it again. Go back through. Keep pausing. Checking your understanding. Checking you're looking for the right things. Leave it a few weeks before you come back to it and have another go. There we go. See you later.